considered to be the most influential writer in the English language, particularly when it comes to the English language itself. In large part due to the British Empire, the English language has spread all over the world, spoken by people all over the world of all ethnicities, and William Shakespeare has traveled wherever the language has. Young people in classrooms on almost every continent have had to read Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, but William Shakespeare was writing during a particular time, obviously, a time just before British colonialism really took hold. However, recent research shows that the England of his day was much more diverse than normally thought of. And William Shakespeare himself certainly wrote about race. Othello is an obvious example, as is Merchant of Venice, but there are other examples too, including Antony and Cleopatra. Today we're going to be in conversation about William Shakespeare and race. My guest for this is Farah Karim-Cooper, who is a professor of Shakespeare Studies at King's College London and director of education at Shakespeare's Globe. And she's the author of the book that she joins us to talk about. It's called The Great White Bard, How to Love Shakespeare While Talking About Race. Farah Karim-Cooper, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Bard. Let's talk about the word bard. Shakespeare wasn't always known as bard, and I myself sometimes say bard frequently without even really knowing what that word means.
Yeah, I mean, it's an ancient word. It really refers to a poet, and usually a poet in the oral tradition. And that word is really given to someone who has a very, very special place in a culture, a particular kind of poet. I mean, for example, Walt Whitman, the great American poet, was trying to fashion himself into the great American bard. So yes, it's people like Virgil, Homer would have been referred to as bards as well. So yes, Shakespeare becomes the bard.
It's a Latin word?
Gosh, that's a great question. I don't actually know the etymology of that word. I'm sure there is a Latin root for that word, which is probably not bard itself. That's probably the English version, but yeah. Linguists out there can correct me.
Shakespeare wasn't always known as the bard.
That's correct. In his own time, Shakespeare was a playwright. So he was known either as a player. He was also an actor, so he sometimes was called player, which was one of the words for actor in that time. He was a playwright, or he might be referred to as a poet, because a lot of plays in that time were written in verse as well as prose. So it's not until the 18th century when Shakespeare becomes sort of much more revered and praised that he's called the bard. And legend has it that the great actor David Garrick was the first one that christened him the bard.
Tell me more about the 18th century and what happens, maybe a bit about a term we like to use, historiography, sort of how the story changes through time, how we tell stories through times and how they change according to the society of its time. Tell me about the historiography of Shakespeare, because actually the 18th century is an important in the transition that happens about the telling of Shakespeare, of who we think of as Shakespeare, changes during this period of time. And this is important in your book in talking about Shakespeare and race.
Yes. So, I mean, Shakespeare, I guess I often talk about two Shakespeares. And so what I want to do really is start with that 16th century Shakespeare that I was just referring to, which was the guy who came to London from Stratford and wanted to be part of a new industry of making plays. The industry had only just come about in the 1570s, and he probably arrives around the late 1580s or early 1590s. And he is in a very scrappy industry that hasn't quite found its footing. He becomes part of a company. He's an actor. He's their house playwright. How he made plays was through really collaborative process. And writing plays back then was very fragmented. You might provide a few acts, or maybe a couple of scenes, and there'd be comments from the actors. Or then eventually the play gets cut up into cue scripts, or parts as we call them. And so there's lots of different stages that these plays go through before they even get on stage. And then if a bunch of audience members don't like the play, you won't see it again. So it's really, really interesting how it worked. And it was very commercial, very sort of immediate and urgent as an industry. And that's really where Shakespeare was and how he worked. As you move through the centuries, Shakespeare does become much more of a presence. And certainly in his own time, there were many people who did revere his work. And he was part of a very prominent theater company that eventually becomes patroned by King James himself, King James the First. So they were very important. They played at court. So there's no doubt that Shakespeare would have rubbed shoulders with all sorts of people. And he gets named at the time as quite literary and revered as a poet. But it's not the level that you see that happens later. So around the late 1600s, early 1700s, you start to see a shift in the perception of Shakespeare, where not only is he, because he was critiqued quite a lot during the Restoration and rewritten and adapted, and then you get to the 18th century, and he's still being rewritten and adapted. That hasn't changed. But the sort of reverence for Shakespeare really starts to take hold. And you can see across lots of different spaces, like not just theater, but also philosophy, art, writers, poets, thinkers. They're all talking about Shakespeare in a way that is really quite extraordinary. He becomes a native genius. He becomes an original genius. They start talking about the ways in which nature speaks through Shakespeare, as if there's some sort of specific divine wisdom that comes with Shakespeare. And he becomes exceptionalized, apart from, as some writers say, other mortals. So that's quite a lot of pressure to put on Shakespeare. And eventually he becomes referred to as a god of our idolatry. And a lot of magazines that were being published at the time would write these sort of huge articles or poems sort of praising Shakespeare as if he was a kind of god. And certainly by the 19th century, he's being read out in church, alongside sermons, alongside scripture. So Shakespeare becomes a kind of a sort of cult of worship almost. Statues are erected in his name. And you didn't have that before when he was alive. There were no statues. There may be one portrait, the one that some people might recognize where he's wearing an earring. That portrait is called the Chandos portrait. And that may be the only one that comes from the time he was alive. Every other image you see of Shakespeare appeared after he died. And certainly the sculptures of him that show this perfect sort of chiseled white Caucasian skull. And essentially, the reason why this is important is because of what else is happening in England in the 18th century. England is forging its empire, and it was one of the largest empires, and I think some people have argued it was the largest empire in the history of the world.
The sun never set.
Yeah, exactly. And part of this project was, in addition to colonialism, was the slave trade. And England was dominating the slave trade throughout the 18th century. And many English wealthy people were plantation owners. And that's largely where the wealth was generated. And so what that enabled England to do was to begin to cultivate a sense of identity, a sense of self that was in some ways a rationale for this sort of beastly behavior that was bringing them all of this wealth. But also they could create and fashion themselves into lovers of art, of theater, producers of the best writing, the best poetry, and the best art. So museums were opening and galleries, and obviously colonial treasures were being brought back. So Shakespeare is sort of spearheading this whole thing, or at least the image of Shakespeare as the native genius and the sort of icon of English supremacy.
In the formation of, I guess, of white supremacy.
Indeed. Shakespeare became, I suppose he was instrumentalized in this, right? He's co-opted. I mean, the real Shakespeare's dead by this point. So, you know, and it's not to say he's not exempt from the, or that he's exempt from the colonial moment, because Queen Elizabeth I had colonial aspirations, and Shakespeare knew it well. But this was a very different era in England. And Shakespeare becomes a really key part of this project. When
I think of colonialism, and Shakespeare is alive during the era of colonialism, because you have Spain, Portugal, Holland, right. But England was always, and you had the slave trade as well. but England was sort of seen as a little bit of a late arrival to this dynamic. I mean, it would end up being the main driver of it, but it was a little bit late in getting into the game.
It was late getting into the game or dominating the game. There were early slave trading expeditions in the 1500s that England had experimented with, and Queen Elizabeth had commissioned, or at least supported. But they failed because Spain was really the sort of giant of the seas in those days. But it did enable them to start laying down some foundations, which eventually led to the formation of the Royal African Company in 1670.
I want to come back to how Shakespeare's day and how his plays were created. You really piqued my interest, because I think I have this more modern notion that maybe came from this 17th, 18th century version of Shakespeare, of a man who was writing in a room alone with a candle. These really deep, thoughtful plays. And what I hear you saying is that actually is not how they were written at all.
No, I mean, obviously there may have been moments where he was sitting alone writing, but because he was a member of a theater company, the way in which they worked back then was very, very collaboratively. So there were principal players, and they were also sharers. So they owned shares in the company. So Shakespeare made money, not just from his writing, but from box office. And then when they built the Globe in 1599, the principal sharers also bought shares in the Globe. So he was a householder. So he also took a certain amount of box office. So this was a very, very shared enterprise. And writing plays, and even today, there are playwrights who come to the Modern Globe and work there, and they work in process with directors, with the actors, rewriting as they rehearse. And there's no question that Shakespeare would have worked in a very, very similar way. And there were plays of his that he collaborated with other playwrights on, like Thomas Middleton and a guy named George Peele, who not a lot of people know of, and John Fletcher. So they were also people who actually wrote with Shakespeare. And in the 18th century, they tended to sort of blank those guys out.
That's interesting. So an actor could have been, during rehearsal of one of his plays when he was still alive, could have been like, no, this line doesn't work. We should say this instead. And it's very possible that, like, okay, yeah, we'll change the line to that.
100%. I mean, Shakespeare gives you little glimpses of what the rehearsal room might have looked like. For example, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, when the mechanicals are rehearsing in the woods, there's all sorts of dynamics there that kind of reveal maybe some of the practice that he would have been part of. And you get a sense, for example, in Hamlet, when Hamlet's giving advice to the players and he says, speak what's written down here, don't just improvise, because that annoyed playwrights when, actors went off script and started saying their own things. So Shakespeare is speaking from experience very much.
I promise not to get too off track here, but does this at all play into the controversy over who exactly wrote these plays?
I think so, because I think it does stem from the 18th century story of Shakespeare, which is the story of a genius who wrote these plays in isolation from his own head and doesn't take into account all the other factors that contributed to the making of these plays. Because, I've spoken to a lot of anti-Stratfordians, and they don't really know the story of how plays were made and how the play texts are sort of, I suppose, edited by so many other people along the way. The journey from the playwright's hand to the stage and then to the printed book is so complex and has so many different people's hands in it that, that was just not how writers worked. But they did work that way in the 18th century.
It's very interesting. Again, historiography is always interesting, and how the stories change throughout time. I mean, you find that in all of history and all the telling of history. And of course, we would have that with William Shakespeare as well. I think part of our shared thoughts about Elizabethan England is that it was not necessarily a diverse place, that it was a place primarily of white people, of white English people. But research of recent years suggests the opposite of that, something very different.
That's correct. Research that emerged, I suppose, largely in 2008, though there had been evidence presented in the past, was the work of now late scholar Imtiaz Habib, who published this amazing tome called Black Lives in the English Archives, where he just provides the evidence of births, christenings, renaming, marriages, deaths, and evidence of an awareness, a cultural awareness of the Black presence, which how scholars refer to it as Black presence studies. And this, dates back to the 16th century. And there are many scholars who argue that there would have been Black Africans in England in the Middle Ages. And then we know that there are classical scholars who have argued for a presence during the ancient Roman age in England. So the assumption that, for example, here that Black people arrived in the 1950s just doesn't hold water. And so it's a really extraordinary finding, and it tells us a very different story than we've been told for a very long time. You look at any period drama set in the 16th century, and all the extras are white. So that has been reinforcing this story, this myth of all-white England. And of course, it fuels some of the culture war today when you see period drama that is inclusive of racially diverse casting. And people sort of lash out and say that we're imposing modern ideas into the past, when actually the past has been laid bare for us. We just need to look closely.
More diverse than we commonly think. It's interesting. I mean, England is a very diverse country,
Yes.
just like the United States. In its own way, obviously, unique characteristics for both, but still both very diverse. Again, there is this notion that the diversity really begins in the 1950s in England.
Yeah, I think some people feel, I think there's a general awareness that in the 18th century, there were Africans living in England. But I think that even if you look at 18th century period dramas, you don't see that evidence necessarily until now. People are becoming more progressive about how they represent the past on TV and film. But I think for the most part, the belief is that they arrived with what they refer to as the Windrush generation, the people who came over, who were invited to come and live in England and work in England in the 1950s from the Caribbean.
How would you characterize, how often do you find people of color in Shakespeare's work? I don't mean like a numerical number, but often in every play. And
well, I think that's an interesting question. I think it depends. So, for example, we know that there are plays that Shakespeare is intending for that character certainly to be considered a racially diverse character. So whether that's an African Moor like Othello or Aaron the Moor, or even the Prince of Morocco in The Merchant of Venice. But then you also have Cleopatra, and she is for some reason people contend that she's white, and that actually the real Cleopatra was Greek, so therefore she can't be Black. Well, Shakespeare's not concerned with the real Cleopatra, he's concerned with his Cleopatra, who he refers to as Black, but for some reason people still insist that she was white. So that's an interesting debate in itself. But her as well, she is very much represented as an African. And then you have characters like Caliban from The Tempest, who isn't explicitly referred to as Black. But because of his origins, it's very, very likely that he is indigenous of some kind and represents some indigenous heritage. And so there's a lot of language in the play, metaphorically, that points to his racialized difference. And a lot of people have been reluctant to accept that even though it's really quite normal now to read The Tempest through a post-colonial lens. And then you have The Merchant of Venice, which has Black character in it, as well as a Jewish character, 3 Jewish characters, actually. Shakespeare presents to you a community of Jews. And it's a really, really it's a hard play. It's a very challenging play because it is extraordinarily full of anti-Semitic tropes and ideas and language. And many people have argued that it shouldn't even be on the curriculum and we shouldn't be performing it anymore. But Shakespeare is very interested in what happens in European economies that rely so much upon diversity in order for those economies to thrive. And so what are the dynamics domestically and socially and culturally? And Shakespeare's always kind of putting a lens on that in these plays. So there's not hundreds of them, but he is exploring different kinds of identities that he would himself very likely have come into contact with, at least Africans he would have come into contact with, perhaps even Jews, even though the Jews had been expelled from England since 1290. Many were living covertly in England or had converted to Christianity. Shakespeare might have known something about that. But in his other plays, it isn't necessarily identities, but it's sometimes references. So there might be a reference to the word Ethiop, for example, which was a word for an African, Ethiopian. It just meant African back then, or it was code for black. And it's used in a few other Shakespeare plays as an insult. And so, at the Globe, for example, when we've done those plays, like Much Ado About Nothing or Midsummer Night's Dream, we've asked questions and actors have asked questions. What do we do with this line? Because it's actually really offensive, right? So there are references to Black identity and Jewish identity in other plays that don't necessarily explicitly have Black people in them.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Farah Karim-Cooper, Professor of Shakespeare Studies at King's College London and Director of Education at Shakespeare's Globe. And she joins us for a conversation about her book called The Great White Bard, How to Love Shakespeare While Talking About Race. I want to break down a few more these characters a little more with you. My interest was really piqued in preparing for our conversation about Antony and Cleopatra and the portrayal of Cleopatra. Of course, there's been this long-ranging debate of whether Cleopatra, what color Cleopatra was she was black or white? And as you point out, in Shakespeare's world, she was very much black. Tell me more about, doesn't Shakespeare get this story? Like most of his stories, they're retelling of previous stories. Doesn't he get this story from the ancient Roman writer Plutarch?
He does. He gets it from Plutarch. And what's really interesting about Plutarch is his work it's not just the lives of these figures that he outlines. He also has another work where he talks about Egypt. And so you've got to read around Plutarch as well if you really want to dig deep into these questions. And what he says about Egyptians is really quite racist. And then some of that language you can see in his version of Cleopatra. And what you get in Cleopatra is this really kind of overly sexualized, seductive, sort of witchy kind of figure who has some really great qualities, who has grace and eloquence and all of those things. But that because she's managed to overcome Antony, who's supposed to be a very austere, really emotionally regulated Roman. I mean, the Romans really cared very deeply about their stoic values of emotional regulation. And he was not. And so that is often looked at as her own power, her power of seduction, and her ability to sort of entrap him in some ways. So all of that language is kind of wrapped together with her race, with her identity. And so I kind of try to identify, how that would translate in a modern way. And of course, thinking about Moya Bailey's term, misogynoir, which is this a very particular kind of misogyny, which is focused on Black women and the stereotypes that Black women are reduced to, even in this day and age. And there are just direct parallels between the way in which people talk about Cleopatra and the way in which people have talked about other Black female figures. And so what I find really difficult is when people argue, but no, there's no evidence that she's Black. And actually she was Greek, so it's very unlikely that she was Black. But historians have argued that the original Cleopatra may have had an African mother, and that her family would have lived in Africa, in Egypt anyway, for about 300 years. So what happens to your identity and your race over time, over that many centuries? So it's a very complex question, a really complex question.
Yeah, and I think it's oftentimes said that Cleopatra is the only queen or king, monarch really, who spoke the Egyptian language.
Yeah, potentially. I suppose so.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there are Shakespeare's plays, which are worth dissecting themselves, but then there's also the production through time of his plays. And Antony and Cleopatra is interesting to look at. Obviously, it's been made into major motion films here in the United States. And I think when people think of Cleopatra on the screen, they think of Elizabeth Taylor.
Yes, Elizabeth Taylor with her sort of darkened makeup. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And that, that film isn't it's sort of rooted in the play, but it's really rooted in the legacy of this couple more than anything else. And, every great actress wants to get her teeth into Shakespeare's Cleopatra. And why not? Because Cleopatra is one of the most extraordinary characters in Shakespeare, with her sort of eloquence and the muscularity of the language. I mean, actors who are really good at verse speaking love speaking her part because it's extraordinary. It's also a very physical role, and it requires a huge amount of energy and virtuosity. And so why wouldn't the greatest actresses of our time want to play this part? And certainly they have. You have Helen Mirren and Judi Dench and Harriet Walter and Janet Sussman and all these amazing actresses who have played this part. And as I say in my book, there's no sort of not trying to throw any shade in their direction, but to say that it's time now to play that part in the way in which Othello was finally positioned. Up until the 1980s, the Royal Shakespeare Company had only white male actors playing Othello. And the tide turned, and people recognized it's not appropriate now for a white actor to play it in blackface. What the difference is that Cleopatra's never really played in blackface. Maybe a little bit of brown or tan makeup I've seen quite a few times, but rarely is she played in blackface, and certainly she wouldn't be today. I hope. But what I'm trying to argue for is that, how about if we start to look at this role as written for a Black woman, or imagined as a Black woman, and have Black actors, Black actresses take a stab at this role?
Is there a common portrayal that Shakespeare presents for his characters of color, like Cleopatra or Othello? And I think oftentimes, and you certainly are going to find racist tropes in these plays. Mm-hmm. It's also oftentimes talked about. These plays are also talked about, though. You also get a depth of these characters that go also beyond the caricatures as well. Do you think that's accurate? How does Shakespeare present his characters of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think the impression of how he does that can be very different if you're an actor playing that part. So if you're a Black actor playing the part of Othello, you might feel trapped in a range of stereotypes, and it can be quite a difficult and challenging experience performing that role, particularly if you are being directed by a white director with a largely all-white company. So I've seen that dynamic a few times, and it can be very uncomfortable. My sense is that there is a certain amount of fantasy that comes with the representation of these roles. But I also think that Shakespeare was much more in tune with different cultures, as I've been arguing, that he had encounters, I believe. I don't know if necessarily that made him an expert, and certainly as a white man, he would not be an expert on the Black male experience. But I don't think he relies on stereotype alone. So you see stereotypes, and it's all the usual stuff, particularly with a character like Aaron the Moor, who's Shakespeare's first sort of exploration of a Black character in Titus Andronicus. And all the villainy tropes, all the devil tropes, all the nasty anti-Black tropes are there. But there's also a dimension to his character that feels hugely paradoxical, where, it's been remarked he's the only good parent in the play. He shows an incredible amount of affection, affiliation when he sees his baby, who is Black. It's a biracial baby. And he wants to protect it. And you see something of Black lineage and Black family and Black identity and Black love. And I found that really extraordinary. And then you have characters like the Prince of Morocco in The Merchant of Venice, who says he comes to choose a casket, which will determine who gets to marry Portia, the sort of orphaned, rich white lady. And he says, "Mislike me not for my complexion." And what he's arguing in his speech is that, in my own country, women love this. And actually our enemies fear it. So actually I quite value it. So I'm going to tell you why. And I think that's a really fascinating thing, because in Aaron the Moor and in the Prince of Morocco, you get this sort of defense of Blackness that doesn't feel defensive. So, some people have argued for Black pride in these plays, which is really interesting. And the Othello is a really unusual character. The chapter, I title it Model Minority, because everyone talks about how this can't really be a play about race because he's doing fine. He's leading an army. He's got the trust of the Duke. What's the problem? The problem's jealousy and Iago. And so that to me is a huge misreading of the play. And actually what Shakespeare gives you there is what happens when you do have a model minority in a white dominant culture, and what that might feel like to be the outsider within. And how the sort of systemic attitudes towards Blackness and whiteness end up being the thing that collapses at the end of the play and destroys that relationship. I've even argued that Iago isn't necessarily a racist himself, but he draws on all these tropes because he knows of the insecurity at the heart of a character like Othello. So yeah, it's multifaceted, I think, and perhaps much less stereotypical than some of his contemporary playwrights who wrote about Jews and Black people. But it's not without its stereotype either.
Is there a thing with Black actors and Shakespeare? And let me explain what I mean by that. I go to Shakespeare plays whenever I can. I did my own little journey, Stratford upon Avon, just before the pandemic hit. Went to the Royal Shakespeare Theatre to see King Lear, and it was primarily, I can't remember exclusively, but primarily Black actors who were performing in it. I go see Shakespeare plays here where I am in the San Francisco Bay Area at Cal Shakes. Frequently, I will see plays in which the casting is primarily Black. And then when I think more about it, there's also a history to this. I think of James Earl Jones in the 1970s doing an all-Black cast of King Lear in Central Park in New York. And then I think farther back to somebody like Paul Robeson, who sort of personified this character of Othello, who had to move to England because he couldn't play Othello here on the stage in the United States, and went to England to where he could play it. So I'm wondering, when I say there's a thing, is there a tradition? Is there sort of a very conscious effort of Black actors doing Shakespeare?
Yes. I mean, this Black actors playing Shakespeare dates back hundreds of years. And I think what's really interesting about it is that it's a tradition in which there's a sense of, you don't have colorblind casting when you've got all Black Shakespeare productions, right? Most of the time, the director will want you to see color. They'll want you to see the race. And certainly that was true of Kenny Leon's Much Ado About Nothing, which was at the Public in 2019. Because there's some sort of, I think in a modern context, he was gesturing towards Black affluence and the relationship that the Black community has to Shakespeare and to the joy of Shakespeare. So that's something very specific. But yes, there is a great tradition of Black actors. Ira Aldridge, who was African American, really made his career traveling around Europe and performing Shakespeare to great acclaim, as well as to I mean, if you read some of the reviews of his performances, they were incredibly racist as well, like extraordinarily racist. But he also was a highly regarded actor across Europe. And so, yes, this is a tradition, but I think it's something that over time people have forgotten about, or it was sort of written out of history. Certainly with the kind of creation of the Royal Shakespeare Company and various other, the National Theatre, which were founded by, white male directors, you get a sense that the history of Black performance in Shakespeare kind of gets written out to a certain extent. And so, and school children certainly aren't learning about it. So they're not necessarily seeing that that's a pathway for themselves. So the more that history can be integrated into thinking about performance history, the better.
Richard III is interesting to me, who's not Black, but who's disabled. And I am a person with a disability as well. And when we talk about some of these dynamics about race, I can't help but also think about Richard III, who a lot of stereotypes, maybe even some of the stereotypes begin with Richard III about being disfigured and disabled. Yet his part is still fascinating. Like I don't hate Richard III. I actually like it, even though he's this evil villain, which is a stereotype of disabled folks. But there is a complexity to him, in which I'll read lines and I'll be like, oh, that was kind of deep. That was a little more insightful than I would actually than I normally would hear anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, Richard III is really interesting because, and this is why, like in the academic world, there's a lot of intersectional studies. So there's a whole area of analysis of Shakespeare called disability studies, and looking at Shakespeare through a disability lens, and how characters will be racialized because of their disability, or they'll be discussed in a particular way that highlights their race, using the language of deformity and monstrosity as well. So there's a lot of intersection between those different categories. So Richard is also described as a devil, black devil, as a toad, all the things that were associated with Blackness. And Blackness was associated very much from the Middle Ages on with the devil. And you can see that in sort of depictions in Europe of the Last Judgment, where you see the white angels and the black devil or black demons. And this kind of color coding creates a kind of form of racial thinking that Shakespeare sort of echoes in his play. He's using very much the same kind of tropes, where these two categories are kind of intersecting regularly. So he is, I think, like many of Shakespeare's villains, complicated, right? He has a past. And actually, if you read the Henry VI plays, you can see his trajectory through, and Shakespeare keeps that trajectory. He keeps that in mind as you're reading Richard III or staging Richard III. So if anybody ever wants to do a full study of him, I always suggest going back to the Henry VI plays and seeing how he develops over time. But he is very complicated. He speaks very openly to the audience. That's what you get in Shakespeare's sort of Machiavellian characters like him or Iago, who speak primarily to the audience through soliloquy. He forms a relationship with you. He establishes a bond with you. He makes you laugh sometimes. He demonstrates vulnerability, like, for example, in the Battle of Bosworth the night before, and he has all those nightmares, and he becomes completely dissociated from himself. And that's a real human feeling, right? That sense of dissociation and fear. And you see the vulnerability of villainy. You get it with Macbeth as well. And so, yes, Shakespeare is definitely providing you multidimensionality while engaging all of those same ideas of stereotype. And I think it's because he's drawing on something that's socially apparent to him and making you see it in two ways at the same time. I call it his sort of double vision, where he asks you to think about the same thing in two different ways simultaneously.
Farah Karim-Cooper is our guest. She talks to us about her book called The Great White Bard, How to Love Shakespeare While Talking About Race. We talked about colonialism. How about Shakespeare's influence throughout the world? Does that play an element in the story that you tell here? If I'm correct on this, you were born in Pakistan. English is obviously spoken in Pakistan. You find Shakespeare everywhere. How does it play out around the world?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Shakespeare is beloved in a lot of countries. In 2012, the Globe put on a festival and invited theater companies from around the world to perform all his plays. So we had 37 plays in 37 languages. So they were in their own languages as well. And it was extraordinary, just extraordinary. And what we found in that experiment was that there is a huge tradition of playing Shakespeare around the world. Every country, every culture has its own storytelling traditions. And Shakespeare is often integrated into those storytelling traditions. You get this amazing, unique, and enlightening, revealing performance. And I remember seeing the Cantonese version of Titus Andronicus, my favorite play.
Mine too.
And
not performed often.
Oh, great.
Not performed often.
No,
Wasn't it the most popular play of his time?
Well, it was one of the very, very popular in his time, but it got a bad rap for centuries.
It's pretty brutal.
But it is indeed. But I didn't understand a word that they said. But the performance, the use of gestures, the use of some of their own performance traditions enabled the story to really come to life for me. And I was just sitting in the auditorium sobbing when Marcus had discovered Lavinia's state, and just that the emotion expressed in that. So what I'm basically saying is that, yes, Shakespeare was exported through the colonial project into lots of parts of the world, including British India. Pakistan came about after partition, obviously. But my mother was born in India, my grandmother born in India. And they would have studied Shakespeare at school. And certainly my dad did. And it was considered the height of British culture. But what's really interesting is in the post-colonial moment or the decolonial moment, when England left those nations, they left Shakespeare behind. And so Shakespeare becomes folded into culture in a way that becomes entirely adaptable and entirely their own, which is why there's a subfield of Shakespeare studies called appropriation. So, people have taken Shakespeare, appropriated him, and performed him in their own way, in their own language, using their own storytelling devices. And what's really interesting about that is that there's a sense of freedom about it, because nobody's there policing what they do with Shakespeare. Shakespeare productions only get policed in the UK or in America, right? By people who think that it should be done in a very particular way, using, the proper pronunciation and not cutting this and not casting it that way. Whereas, nobody's there policing Shakespeare. So the freedom with which Shakespeare's explored in those countries is phenomenal and enviable.
I do want to ask you about the British accent and the pressure to have and use the British accent. Just the other day, we did a show on early American movie star Anna May Wong, first Asian American movie star. She went to England. She was wildly popular in the silent films, but then when the talkies came on, and when the talking movies came, and she started talking, she talked like a Californian, which was a big no-no. And so she had to spend a lot of money and learn the British accent. Does the British does the British accent play a role in race?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. I mean, I think in terms of production, certainly in the UK, not so much in the US, that um, there's a kind of received pronunciation, or RP as it's known as, is considered the appropriate verse speaking mode, right? And a lot of audience, even to this day, will be like, well, I didn't understand a word they said because there was a Birmingham accent or a Liverpool accent or something. And it's really snobby. I mean, class and accents is a whole other field in this country, right? Um, and it is very alienating. I do remember a time we did a production in 2005 of Pericles at the Globe, and it was a very multi-ethnic and multicultural cast, and they were enabled to speak the verse in their own accents. And the snobbery and the racism and the classism that came out in the reviews was really quite something to look at. I mean, I don't know if anybody would print stuff like that now. 2005 doesn't seem that long ago to me. And
well,
so
wasn't that long ago where Amazon put out a new J.R. Tolkien special based on one of his books, in which people were outraged that there were people of color in that. And that was just a year ago.
Yeah, no, I mean, people do not want, I mean, people getting angry about the Little Mermaid being played by a black actor. So, I mean, it's just getting a little out of hand. It's a mermaid. So anyway, yes, accent is a site for, snobbery and classism. And race does come into it because, there are people from South Asian backgrounds that play Shakespeare, and they play it in their accents. So it's a very interesting space.
You had a piece in Time magazine in which you say there's racism in Shakespeare. There's no question about it, but you also call for him not to be canceled.
Yes. I think a lot of people are worried that Shakespeare is feeling less accessible to younger generations, that he doesn't feel relevant, and that his work can actually be really offensive in this age where young people are leaning into identity in a way that previous generations hadn't felt empowered to, or hadn't felt brave enough to. And that Shakespeare's plays do have tropes in them that are misogynistic. There's anti-Black humor, there's anti-Black racism, there's anti-Semitism. And what do you do with that? And my argument is that you don't necessarily toss Shakespeare by the wayside, because actually the plays are also very concerned with climate and human...
Climate?
Yeah, human destruction of climate. Do you know, there's a whole field of eco-studies in Shakespeare. And there was a real anxiety at that time about deforestation, because London was expanding and forests were being chopped down, and people were really nervous about what this meant. I think there's even a story about whales beaching and King James claiming those whales as his own. So there were some sort of natural events that were occurring, and people were anxious about the destruction of the planet. And people are always anxious about the destruction of the planet, but Shakespeare has something to say about it. And gender is a really interesting question in Shakespeare. These parts were played by boys initially. And so there's a lot of cross-dressing, jokes about identity and queer desire. And it's a really extraordinary space for people to explore, thinking about the long history of gender fluidity and gender identity. And so I don't think it's something we need to toss away. I think we need to really dig in and start to feel a bit brave about it, because for some reason, I think we think that we all are entitled to comfort all the time. Well, I mean, discomfort is really normal. I mean, you sit in a chair for an hour and a half and you're uncomfortable, right? Why do we need Shakespeare to be comfortable? It doesn't have to be. So that's my main argument in that piece, is that the reason why Shakespeare feels unapproachable and difficult is because of that 18th century fantasy that I outlined earlier.
Interesting. Farah Karim-Cooper, has been our guest. Farah Karim-Cooper is professor of Shakespeare Studies at King's College London, director of Shakespeare, while talking about race. Farah Karim-Cooper, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it so much. Thanks for having me.